How's it going? My name is Austin Gill, and I want to share with you a recent cloud computing win story that I heard about, where a customer was able to significantly reduce their cloud computing costs by switching from AWS to Linode. So today, I'm going to show you how. Now, before we dig in, I should mention that all of the links for everything that I cover are going to be in the video description, as well as a promotional link for new customers to get $100 in free credit towards Linode products. So be sure to check out the description to get that link. Okay, let's dig in. So the customer we're talking about today is a smart TV manufacturer, one of the major ones, and they have to, as part of their operation, distribute software patches to millions of devices all over the world. Now, they trust Akamai with the delivery, and that's been working great. However, they noticed that the storage and egress costs were becoming an issue. So here's kind of a simplified example of what their architecture diagram might look like. They have some software engineers that need to upload the firmware versions, and they do that through Elastic File System, which is a virtual drive in the cloud. For them, it basically looks like managing files and folders on a local machine, but in reality, the files get sent to folders in AWS. Now, this is a very key point, but we're going to come back to it shortly. Now, when it's time for a smart TV to check for updates, it'll make a request that passes through Elastic Load Balancer, ends up going to the database, and returns with the path to the latest firmware version. Finally, with the path to that software, the TV is able to make a request to download the firmware, which passes through Akamai CDN, gets cached globally, and that makes the distribution fast and resilient. Now, the problem with this setup is not with the file management or with the delivery. In fact, those have been working well for a long time. The problem is really with the storage costs. EFS is a very convenient tool for managing folders and files in the cloud, but when you are dealing with storage and egress at a certain scale, there are much cheaper options, namely something like object storage.
If we compare pricing at the time of recording between AWS and Linode products, we would see that EFS has a cost of $0.3 per gigabyte per month for storage and $0.03 per gigabyte per month for transfer. S3, on the other hand, which is AWS's object storage product, it's going to be a little bit more complicated because it has tiered pricing based on volume, but it starts out at $0.023 per gigabyte per month for storage and $0.09 per gigabyte per month for transfer. Linode, on the other hand, has an object storage product that only costs $0.02 per gigabyte per month for storage and $0.005 per gigabyte per month for transfer.
Ultimately, in this story, the customer ended up going with the cheapest option, which was Linode. Now, it's worth mentioning that apples-to-apples comparisons like this are very difficult, and rarely is pricing the only determining factor in a big decision like this. But I digress. The decision to use object storage offered a better pricing solution, but it introduced new technical challenges. The existing system and workflows were built around EFS. But the new system was going to be built on object storage, and these are not compatible. Fortunately, a solution came from an open source library called S3FS, which offers an interface similar to EFS, but it turns all of the interactions into S3 compatible API calls. In other words, firmware engineers would continue to use a workflow that they were familiar with, televisions would continue to receive their software updates through Akamai CDN, but the major difference being that the storage and the bandwidth costs would be greatly reduced. So here's what that same architecture diagram might look like, but with these updated changes. The firmware engineers will continue to upload software the same way, the smart TVs will continue to download the software in the same way, but the files are being stored in object storage buckets instead of on EFS. It's also worth pointing out here that there is an additional VPS that uses rclone, another open source tool, to sync files between a primary and a fallback object storage bucket. This is for resiliency. By transitioning from AWS's Elastic File System to Linode's Object Storage, the customer was able to drastically reduce their cloud spending costs, with object storage costing about 1/15 the price of EFS. They also saw a 90% reduction in egress costs, marking a substantial reduction from their previous setup. Given those constraints, I thought it would be interesting to run some hypothetical numbers so that we can see just how big of a difference this could look like. Let's consider a hypothetical scenario where on a monthly basis, a customer manages 50 terabytes of stored data plus 100 terabytes of outbound transfer. With AWS Elastic File System, that would be $18,000 per month. If you compare that to AWS S3, it would be about $8,950 per month. And lastly, with Linode Object Storage, you would get $1,500. So this only covers storage and bandwidth costs. It doesn't account for things like introducing CDN as a product. It's also worth mentioning that some providers will offer more discounted rates depending on the volume if you talk to some of their sales teams. So that's very common with enterprise customers. So take this all with a grain of salt. So caveats aside, in this example, the Linode Object Storage costs about 1/15 the price of Elastic File System and about 1/7 the price of AWS's S3, assuming you don't use CloudFront as the CDN. So for this customer story, Linode Object Storage was the final winner considering costs and existing constraints, but that's not the main point that I want to focus on. Doing cost comparisons across products is an important step for making a decision on which products you're going to land on. But as we can see, they're very nuanced and often highly subjective. The main point that I want you to take home is that we as software engineers often have disproportionate amount of leverage in choosing the products that the company ultimately decides on. And those decisions that we make should not be taken lightly because they can have such a major impact on the bottom line. With all that said, if you feel like giving Linode Object Storage a try or any of the other Linode products, I want to remind you that we do have a link in the description to get you $100 in free credits for new customers, as well as links for all of the other things that we talked about in this video. So thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed this, and be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon to get updates when another video comes out. All right, catch you next time.